The wind came in gusts down the main street of Santa Rosa, dragging with it a choking mix of dust, heat, and the scent of sweat-soaked livestock. Late summer in the Arizona territory didn't give second chances, not to the land, not to the people, and certainly not to a trembling 10-year-old boy in a torn shirt, bare feet, and tear-streaked cheeks. "My mom is in there," Samuel cried out, voice cracked and wild, pointing to a rusted iron bin leaning against the back of Garrett's blacksmith shop. "She's inside, I swear it." No one looked. No one paused. A few passing cowhands snorted. One woman muttered something about sunstroke and hurried her children along. The rest didn't even slow their steps. It was as if the dust had swallowed the boy's voice whole, Samuel's fists curled, thin shoulders shaking. "Please," he whispered to no one in particular. "She's dying in there." From across the road, in the long shadow of the old adobe jail, a man sat still atop a paint horse. The brim of his brown cowboy hat shadowed most of his face, but his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, followed the boy. He hadn't meant to linger in Santa Rosa, just a quick trade, rabbit pelts for coffee and cornmeal. But the boy's cry had found its way under his skin like cactus needles. Tahu Boone clicked his tongue softly. The paint horse didn't move. He didn't either. He had heard that voice before. Not that boy's, but one just like it years ago, in a different place, calling for help no one came to give. His nephew, his sister, gone in smoke and fire when cavalry came, and no one believed a child's scream then either. He'd sworn after that. Never again would he bind his soul to the pain of strangers. White town, white problems. And yet, the boy's voice came again, raw now. I heard her call. I swear I heard her say my name. Tahu turned the horse. "Boy." His voice came out like broken gravel. Samuel spun. Dirt streaked his face. His eyes were too big for his face, too old for his years. "You said she's in an iron bin?" "Where?" Samuel blinked, then pointed. "Back behind Garrett's shop. It's big enough to hold grain, but they don't use it no more. I heard her. I did. Tahu studied him. No shame, no lie. Just fear and love too big for a child's frame. Show me." They moved quick, cutting through the alley behind the blacksmith's shop. Shadows stretched long, broken by piles of broken wagon wheels and rusted horseshoes. At the far end stood a bin tall, wide, its corners softened by rust. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Samuel ran up, pressing his ear against the hot metal. "Mama! Mama, I brought help!" Silence. Then faint, muffled a sound. Not words, not quite, but human. Tahu felt his stomach tighten. He dropped from the saddle in one fluid motion. Crouched low, fresh scratches along the bin's lid, a brass lock clean and new. No dust on it, no weathering. Someone wanted this sealed. "What's your mama's name?" "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Herrera." Her father had the big ranch east of town before he passed. Tahu nodded once. The pieces moved quickly now. If the mother was in there, someone put her there on purpose. He stood and looked down at the boy. "We need the sheriff." Samuel shook his head fast. "Sheriff Collins won't listen." "I already tried," Tahu didn't argue. Instead, he drew a small knife from his belt and tested the edge of the lid. Solid. Reinforced. "Run to the jail," he said. "Tell Collins that Tahu Boone sent you." "Tell him there's evidence of a crime," Samuel hesitated. "You believe me?" Tahu didn't blink. "Children don't lie about their mothers being stolen." The boy ran like his feet were on fire. Tahu remained crouched, back resting against the side of the bin. The desert wind picked up. Somewhere a bell rang in the distance. He let the silence stretch, listening. Then came it again. A weak cough, a rasped breath. Inside. She was alive. For now. He didn't realize how tight his grip had become on the knife until he felt the steel bite into his palm. 20 minutes later, the sound of boots and metal echoed down the alley. Collins arrived, flanked by 2 deputies. The sheriff was broad and thick around the middle, but his eyes were sharp. "This better not be another fool's errand," he grumbled. "You hear me, Boone?" Tahu didn't reply. He just pointed to the bin. One of the deputies stepped forward, crowbar in hand. It took 2 men to wedge the lock open. The metal groaned like a dying thing. When the lid lifted, the stench of rust and sweat spilled out. The deputies stepped back. Inside, curled in on herself, lay a woman in a torn blue calico dress. Her wrists were rope-burned, her hair matted, her body bruised. But her eyes, when they fluttered open, were sharp, brown, angry, alive. "Samuel," she whispered, cracked voice full of dust. "I told them," the boy said, pushing past the deputies and falling to his knees. "I told them you were in there." She tried to raise her hand but only managed a twitch. The deputies looked shaken. "Get her to the infirmary," Collins ordered. "Now!" As they lifted Elizabeth from the bin, Tahu caught a glimpse of something carved into the inside wall. Just 4 letters. A H. Andrew Herrera. Tahu said nothing, just followed the stretcher as they carried her through the alley. At the infirmary, Nurse Sarah Mitchell took charge. Strong, no nonsense, she waved off questions and pulled the curtain shut. Tahu leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. Collins joined him a few minutes later. "She said anything?" Tahu didn't turn his head. "She said her brother did it." "Andrew." "For the land," the sheriff grunted. "That's so. You gonna act? Can't just arrest a man on hearsay, Boone. You know that she was locked in a grain bin to die." "I'll look into it." Tahu turned his head. "You'll look into it." While he plans his next move, Collins held his gaze. "It's the territory, Boone. Not D.C. We don't have courtrooms and juries lined up. We got saloons, rumors, and the barrel of a gun. You want me to make a move, you bring me more than a bruised woman and a scared boy." Silence stretched long. "You've changed," Tahu said quietly. Collins's jaw worked. "You haven't." The sheriff turned and walked away. Back inside, Samuel sat beside his mother, her hand in his. The room was dim, lit only by oil lamp. Elizabeth's face, even gaunt and battered, still held grace. Her voice was hoarse, but her words came clear. "I wouldn't sign it. He told me I didn't have a choice." "I said I did," Tahu crouched beside her. "You have one now," he said. Her eyes found his. "Do I?" Tahu stood and looked out the window. The town lay quiet, bathed in orange dusk. People walked like nothing had happened, like no woman had nearly died 5 feet from their backyards. He knew then, if he left, this would all get buried. The lies, the bruises, the boy's courage, and the truth. If he walked away now, no one would come back for them. He adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing. They weren't his people, but maybe that didn't matter anymore. Not when a woman had the fight to resist, and a boy had the heart to scream into silence. Maybe the world didn't need more strangers turning away. Maybe it needed men like him to turn back, and this time, stay. Chapter 2. The woman they tried to silence. The town's infirmary was little more than 2 connected rooms behind the church, but Nurse Sarah Mitchell had made it feel like sanctuary. The sharp smell of carbolic acid filled the space as Sarah cleaned the wounds on Elizabeth's wrists, her movements quick but gentle. Tahu sat in a wooden chair just outside the doorway, hat on his knee, jaw clenched tight. He hadn't spoken much since they brought Elizabeth in. He didn't need to. The silence coming off him said plenty. Inside, Samuel refused to leave his mother's side. He held her hand in both of his small fingers clutching hers like he was afraid she'd vanish again. Elizabeth, though pale and weak, kept her eyes open, watching him with the fierce tenderness only a mother could manage. Sarah leaned close, voice low. "You were lucky," she said. "Another few hours in that heat and—" Elizabeth nodded faintly. "I know." The door creaked as Sheriff Collins stepped in. He gave a nod to Tahu, who didn't return it. "She awake?" Collins asked Sarah. "She's awake," Sarah said, standing and folding her arms. "And clear-headed, in my professional opinion." Collins walked in slowly, taking off his hat. "Ma'am," he said to Elizabeth, "glad to see you survived." "Lot of folks were worried. I doubt that," she rasped. Collins offered a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your boy made quite the scene." Lucky Boone here listened. Elizabeth turned her gaze toward the doorway, catching Tahu's silhouette in the fading light. Her voice was low but steady. "He's the only one who did." Collins cleared his throat. "I need to ask you some questions if you're able." "I'm able." "Do you know who locked you in the bin?" "My brother." Andrew Collins didn't blink. "Can you tell me why?" "He wants our father's ranch." Tried to get me to sign over the deed. When I refused, he said I needed to see reason. I woke up in that bin. Any witnesses? Anybody see him do it? "No, he's too smart for that." Collins rubbed his jaw. "You understand that's a serious accusation. Without proof." Elizabeth's hand twitched in Samuel's. "He threatened me before. Said if I didn't sign, he'd make sure I couldn't make decisions anymore. He's planning something. If you wait too long, he'll finish it." Samuel looked up. "He said she was sick in the head, but she's not. She's my mom. She reads the Bible every night and makes cinnamon bread on Sundays." "She's not crazy," Collins sighed. "Boy, I believe you love your mama, and that means the world, but proving a crime's another matter." Elizabeth's eyes locked on his. The morning sun rose hot and indifferent over Santa Rosa. Elizabeth sat propped up in the infirmary's only bed, her eyes sharper than they'd been the day before, but her skin still pale and bruised in shades of purple and gray. Samuel had barely left her side, except to fetch water or whisper updates through the curtain to Tahu, who stood guard just beyond. At first light, Sheriff Collins had returned with Dr. Evans in tow. The physician stood tall and polished in his waistcoat, spectacles perched low on his nose as he leafed through a small leather notebook with self-importance. "I've reviewed her condition," he declared to Collins, loud enough for Sarah the nurse to bristle from across the room. "There's evidence of confusion, memory gaps, disorientation, classic signs of trauma-induced instability, and dehydration, of course." Elizabeth blinked slowly, watching him like a hawk. "I told you what happened." Evans barely looked at her. "Yes, and those statements are noted. However, it's not uncommon for patients in your condition to create false narratives. A survival mechanism." Tahu stepped in then, voice low and rough. "You think she imagined being locked in a grain bin?" Evans shrugged. "I'm saying we need to consider all possibilities before assigning blame." Sarah snorted behind her mask of civility. "You didn't say that yesterday." Evans ignored her. Collins closed his notebook with a sharp flick. "Let's keep things civil. We'll proceed with caution. No arrests until we have something solid." Tahu's fists tightened, but he said nothing. "Not yet." Later that afternoon, as Elizabeth dozed and Sarah mixed tinctures at the back table, Samuel climbed onto the bench outside the infirmary with something clutched in his arms. Tahu glanced down. "What have you got there?" Samuel held up a faded rag bear, its seams lopsided, its button eyes mismatched. "Mama made it for me. From one of her old dresses. When I couldn't sleep, she'd tell me to hold it close. Said it would remind me she was near Tahu, nodded once, unsure what to say. The boy turned the bear over in his hands. Last night, I felt something in the seam. Tahu straightened. Show me. Samuel worked at the stitching with a small pocket knife, careful not to damage the fabric. After a moment, he pulled out a scrap of folded paper, yellowed and creased. Tahu took it, unfolding it carefully. His eyes moved across the neat, harsh handwriting. He couldn't read it, not well. The letters were blocky, but the tone bled through. Samuel looked up. You can't read it. Tahu shook his head. But I know someone who can. They left quietly, slipping out through the back alley behind the infirmary. The town was waking up, but no one paid them much mind. That was good. Quiet was good. David Tran's office sat above the general store, wedged between stacks of ledgers and crates of old whiskey. He was a slight man in a threadbare coat, no older than 30, but with eyes that missed nothing. He had arrived in Santa Rosa 6 months earlier, a man of mixed heritage and even more mixed reception. Some townsfolk called him shifty. Others called him smart. Tahu called him useful. You came early, Tran said without looking up. I came with this, Tahu replied, holding out the note. Tran took the paper and studied it in silence. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. This, he said, isn't just a note. Samuel shifted anxiously. What does it say? Tran glanced at him, then read aloud. Sign, and this ends. Resist, and Santa Rosa will believe you're sick. Samuel will be safe if you cooperate. A.H. The boy flinched. Tahu's jaw clenched. It's him. Tran nodded. Andrew Herrera. This is coercion, plain and simple. It's written proof he planned to make your mother look unstable and use her son as leverage. It's enough to get the sheriff's attention. Maybe even the judge in Tucson. If this goes that far, Samuel stared at the note like it might catch fire. What do we do now? He asked. Tran folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. We protect it. And we start building a case. Tahu looked around the cluttered office. And if Andrew finds out? Tran smiled grimly. Then we make sure he's the one who should be afraid. Just then the door creaked open behind them. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, with road dust on his boots and a badge tucked beneath his coat. He had the worn look of someone who had slept more in saddles than in beds. You Tran? He asked. I am. The man nodded toward Tahu. And you're Boone, the Apache tracker. Tahu didn't move. Who's asking? Name's Jack Riley. I came from Tucson. Heard there might be some interesting financial irregularities tied to a man named Andrew Herrera Tran. Raised a brow. And what brings a detective all the way out here? Riley stepped further into the room, his voice quiet but sharp as a drawn blade. Because Andrew doesn't just owe one man in Tucson. He owes 3, and the men he owes money to. He paused. They don't wait long, and they don't ask nicely. The back room of the infirmary was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp on the corner table. The scent of carbolic acid still hung in the air, but something else filled the space tonight. Urgency. The kind that made people lower their voices even when the walls were thick. Elizabeth sat propped against a pillow, her wrists still bandaged. She looked stronger than she had 2 days earlier, but the shadows under her eyes remained. Her son sat at her side, refusing to move more than a foot from her since she was found. Tahu stood near the door, arms crossed, the brim of his brown hat tipped low. David Tran leaned over a stack of documents, muttering quietly to himself as he sorted through legal filings and maps. Jack Riley, the detective from Tucson, leaned against the far wall, arms folded, watching the group with an alert calm that came from years of being in rooms like this. And at the center of it all was Sarah Mitchell, nurse, midwife, and town backbone, her gray-streaked bun pulled tight, her eyes fierce behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "We have a note," Tran said, holding up the paper Samuel had found in the rag bear. "We have motive. Andrew wants the land. He's in debt. Bad debt." Riley nodded. "I confirmed that. 3 separate creditors in Tucson. One of them rides with a gunman. Another owns a mining crew with a reputation for making people disappear." "And we have what?" Sarah said, her voice edged. "A note hidden in a toy? A bruised woman that half the town still doesn't believe? A child's testimony? Don't get me wrong, I believe her. I'd bet my hands on it. But I know how people are in this town." "So we make them see," Elizabeth said quietly. All eyes turned to her. "We show them what he really is. But we can't confront him head-on. He's too good at pretending. Too good at twisting the truth." Tahu spoke for the first time in 10 minutes. "He's arrogant. He thinks everyone's beneath him. That's the crack. We let him think he's winning." Tran looked up. "You're suggesting what exactly?" "We let him keep acting like he's in control." "No," Tahu said. "We make him overplay his hand." Silence. Then Sarah exhaled, long and steady. "He tried to get me to falsify her medical records," she said. "Tried to bribe me. Told me I'd lose my position if I didn't help make her look unstable." "And did you?" Tran asked, already knowing the answer. "I told him he could stuff his threats in his Sunday hat." Elizabeth gave the smallest smile, and Samuel grinned for the first time in days. Riley stepped forward. "If we're going to draw him out, we need bait. Something he wants badly enough to rush his plans. Something that makes him move without thinking. He wants the land," Tran said. "What if we pretend she's about to sign?" Elizabeth straightened. "I won't fake that." "I won't lie, no one's asking you to," Riley said gently. "But maybe the town hears a rumor. Maybe someone slips up and lets it accidentally leak that you're reconsidering, that you're willing to negotiate with Andrew under certain conditions." Samuel tensed. "It's dangerous." "What if he comes after her again?" "He will," Tahu said, "but this time we'll be watching." Tran opened his satchel and pulled out a stack of deeds and land filings. "I've been digging through property records. Something's not right. There are gaps, pages that don't match, signatures that look too clean. I think Andrew has already tried to forge part of the transfer." "Can you prove it?" Elizabeth asked. "Not yet. But I'm close." Sarah poured coffee for everyone. "Then we give him just enough rope. Let the rumor mill churn. I'll let it slip to one of the church ladies that Elizabeth's agreed to talk with Andrew." Riley grinned. "Church gossip travels faster than telegraphs." Samuel stood suddenly. "I'm staying here. If something happens again, I want to be with her." Elizabeth looked at her son, love and fear flickering behind her eyes. "It's not safe." "I wasn't safe when you were gone," he said. "I sleep better beside you." Tahu stepped forward and knelt beside Samuel. "You're brave." "But brave doesn't mean reckless." Samuel met his eyes. "Neither does love." Tahu studied him for a long moment, then stood. "He stays." The room buzzed with agreement, tension rising like desert heat before a storm. "We set the bait," Riley said. "Watch who he talks to, where he goes, what papers he touches. The moment he tries to make it real, we move." Everyone nodded. They had a plan, a dangerous one, but it was the only path forward. As the others began to clear the room, gathering documents and refilling oil lamps, Tahu lingered at the doorway. The lamplight caught the edge of his face, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. He looked out into the dark street, then back at the faces behind him, worn but determined. He didn't raise his voice. "In my tribe," he said softly, "when we hunt dangerous prey, we don't corner it. They looked up. "We give it a path to run." Then wait at the end of that path. Santa Rosa slept with its doors bolted and lamps out, but not all its men did. Tahu moved like a shadow through the stillness, his boots barely scuffing the ground as he slipped down alleys and past shuttered windows. The night wind carried the scent of mesquite and sweat, mingled with the sharpness of cooling iron from Garrett's forge. Above, stars blanketed the desert sky, clear and indifferent. He had been watching Andrew Herrera for 3 days. What struck Tahu wasn't how Andrew strutted in public. He expected that. It was how well he knew the rules of manipulation. The smiles, the polite nods, the hushed conversations with townsfolk who still thought the Herrera name meant something noble. But when the sun dipped low and folks turned in, Andrew changed. He grew twitchy, restless. And that's when Tahu followed. Tonight, Andrew had slipped out the back door of the hotel just past midnight, dressed in his best coat but walking fast, like a man late to a deal. Tahu tailed him past the edge of town to a boarded-up office once used by land surveyors. The building looked abandoned to most, but Tahu had seen too many camps built in hollow logs and ruined cabins not to notice signs of use. The hinges had been oiled, the dirt scuffed fresh, and the lantern inside had been lit before Andrew even reached the door. Tahu found his perch in the shadows of the brush line just across the way. Downwind, eyes narrowed. Through the window, 3 figures gathered. Andrew sat at the table, back straight, jaw clenched. Across from him sat a man in a pinstriped vest with silver cufflinks that gleamed even in lamplight, a notary from Tucson, or so Andrew had introduced him earlier that week. But Tahu had followed the man's trail when he arrived. The truth was uglier. He'd been disbarred 2 years earlier for falsifying titles. And the third man, he was trouble. Big frame, scar across his temple, silver ring on his pinky. Rode into town 2 nights ago on a black gelding with prison brands under the saddle. No name, no talk, just watched and waited. Now he stood with his back against the wall, arms folded as Andrew spoke. "Everything's in place," Andrew said, voice sharp through the open window. "They think she's weak." Ready to compromise, the scarred man didn't move. "And if she doesn't?" Andrew's hand curled on the table. "She will." One more push. "I know her." "You'd better," the man said, his voice thick with warning. "Because my boss doesn't like waiting. He doesn't like bleeding money, and he damn sure doesn't like liars." Andrew leaned forward. "By tomorrow night, I'll have the signature. Or," Andrew's smile was thin, "or she'll learn what happens to stubborn women." That was enough. Tahu melted backward from the brush, silent and fast, keeping low as he crossed back toward the stable yard behind the infirmary. He moved with purpose now, a tension in his body he hadn't felt in years. The kind of tension that came just before the first arrow flew, or the ambush was sprung. Inside the infirmary, the back room glowed warm with lamplight. Samuel lay curled at the foot of his mother's bed, one hand clutching the rag bear, his chest rising and falling slow and steady. Elizabeth sat upright against the headboard, ledger papers on her lap, but her eyes had been watching the window. She saw him before he stepped in. "You've got that look," she said softly, "the one men wear when they come back from hunting something too big." Tahu removed his hat, exhaled slow. "He's moving." Tomorrow night, Elizabeth's spine straightened. "He said that?" "He said he'd have your signature." "And if not," Tahu paused, then added, "he said you'd find out what happens to stubborn women." She set the ledger aside, her hand reaching instinctively for her son's. "He's never changed," she said. "Always thought pressure fixed everything, first with words, then fists, then whatever this has become." "He's desperate," Tahu said. "That makes him sloppy." "And dangerous," Elizabeth nodded, her jaw set. Then let's use that. You still want to go through with the plan? She looked down at Samuel, then back at Tahu. I'm tired of running in my own town, of hiding behind curtains while he makes deals in shadows. We make this public, clean, precise, and final. Tahu met her eyes. You don't have to do this. I already did, she said, the moment I refused to sign. Outside, a dog barked once in the distance, then silence again. Samuel stirred in his sleep and muttered something unintelligible, shifting closer to his mother. Elizabeth smoothed his hair back, her fingers gentle but sure. We end it tomorrow, she said, her voice low. Tahu watched her for a long moment, then turned to the door. Before stepping into the night, he spoke one final time, just above a whisper. In my tribe, when we hunt dangerous prey, we don't corner it. We give it a path to run, then wait at the end of that path. The morning broke warm and yellow across Santa Rosa, the kind of day that usually passed quiet and slow. But inside the infirmary, the air was thick with something else, something electric. Elizabeth sat upright in bed, a soft blue shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hair had been brushed, her eyes clear and sharp. There was no more tremble in her voice, no more haze in her words. Samuel sat beside her, quiet but alert, the rag bear resting in his lap. Sarah paced near the windows, checking the latch once, then again. Tahu stood against the far wall, arms folded, back straight. He hadn't said much all morning. He didn't need to. At precisely 9 o'clock, boots sounded in the hallway. Sheriff Collins entered first, his face unreadable, followed by Andrew Herrera pressed suit, clean-shaven, eyes full of a polished concern that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Ellie, Andrew said warmly, his voice just the right note of worried brother. You don't know how good it is to see you awake. I've been sick with worry. Elizabeth didn't answer. She just looked at him. Collins nodded to Sarah. You said she was up to a conversation. She's stronger than she looks, Sarah replied without looking at Andrew. Andrew took a step closer, hands clasped in front of him like a preacher on Sunday. Ellie, I know this has all been confusing. The heat, the stress, waking up in a strange place. But I'm here now. I want to help. I've spoken to Dr. Evans. I'm sure you have, Elizabeth said flatly. Right on cue, Dr. Evans entered, smoothing his coat and holding a medical file in one hand. He nodded to Andrew, then turned to Collins. I've reviewed Elizabeth's condition again, he said formally. While she appears lucid, I remain concerned about her mental state. Prolonged exposure, trauma, dehydration. These factors can result in vivid hallucinations, false memories, emotional instability. She's not unstable, Samuel said quietly. Evans didn't hear him or didn't want to. In cases like this, he continued, it's not uncommon for the patient to assign blame to family members, especially when trust has eroded. I suggest a temporary conservatorship just until she recovers fully. You mean give him control of her land and her son, Sarah snapped. Evans stiffened. I mean ensure she's protected from making decisions in a compromised state. That's funny, said a voice from the hall. Because I have evidence she's been making the clearest decisions in this town. David Tran stepped into the room with a small leather folder under his arm. He moved with quiet confidence, nodding politely to Collins before approaching the bed. I apologize for the interruption, Sheriff, but I think what I've found will be relevant to this conversation. He opened the folder and laid out 3 documents on the small table beside Elizabeth's bed. Each one bore a signature, a date, and a notary seal. But none of them matched, and more importantly, none of them matched Elizabeth's real signature. These documents, Tran explained, claim that Elizabeth signed over portions of her father's ranch to Andrew Herrera. They're all dated within the last 4 months. But here's the problem. He pointed to the inconsistencies in the handwriting. The signatures don't match her known legal records. In fact, 2 of these use a stylized E she never uses, and all 3 are notarized by a man who hasn't held a valid commission in Arizona territory since being disbarred in Tucson last year. Andrew's face twitched just slightly. "I don't know what you're implying," he said, "but I would never—" "I'm not implying," Tran said calmly. "I'm stating. These are forgeries." Elizabeth looked up at her brother, her voice steady. "You didn't even try to copy my signature properly." Andrew shifted, the mask slipping an inch. "She's clearly confused," Evans cut in. "I can assure you these symptoms can cause paranoia, projection." "Stop," Sarah interrupted, her voice cold as stone. "I've been with her for 3 days. I've documented everything. Rope burns, dehydration, coherence of thought, emotional stability. There is nothing wrong with this woman's mind." She walked across the room and handed her own file to Collins. "Here's the medical report. Real, honest, and backed by someone who doesn't answer to men like Andrew Herrera." Andrew's voice rose. "This is absurd. You're all conspiring against me. You're letting this—" His eyes snapped toward Tahu, who hadn't said a word, hadn't moved an inch. Andrew's face twisted with something older than anger, something rotted. "This half-breed savage whispers in your ear and you all go blind. You're fools, every one of you." The room went still. Samuel stood, slow and deliberate, stepping between Andrew and Tahu. "Tahu saved my mother's life," he said. "He listened when nobody else would. That makes him more of a man than you'll ever be." Andrew opened his mouth, but the words died on his tongue, because Collins had drawn his revolver, not pointed, just resting in his hand, heavy and final. "Andrew Herrera," he said calmly, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy to unlawfully seize property. You have the right to stay quiet. And I suggest you do." The sheriff turned to his deputy at the door. "Get the irons." Andrew stared around the room like it had betrayed him. And in truth, it had. The days of quiet control, of whispered threats and forged papers, were over. He saw it now in his sister's eyes, in the doctor's silence, in the boy's defiance, and in the Apache who never once looked away. As the cuffs closed around his wrists, the only sound was the slow, steady breathing of Elizabeth Herrera. She looked down at her son and took his hand in hers. Samuel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The trial didn't take long. In a territory like Arizona, where law still walked in boots and truth often had to shout to be heard, the facts spoke loud enough on their own. Andrew Herrera sat stone-faced in the small courthouse, hands bound, mouth shut, as Sheriff Collins presented forged documents and testimony from both David Tran and Sarah Mitchell. The false notary had vanished the night before, but Riley had tracked down a witness who'd seen him take money from Andrew behind the telegraph office. That, along with the written threat sewn into Samuel's bear and the confirmed debts to Tucson creditors, painted a picture too ugly to ignore. No jury was needed. Judge Markham read the evidence twice, then looked at Andrew like a man staring at a broken mirror. "You used your sister's pain as leverage. You forged her name, plotted to seize what wasn't yours, and nearly left her to die in a rusted bin behind a blacksmith's shop. In a state with looser laws, you'd be hanged. But I'll settle for 20 years hard labor in Yuma." Andrew didn't flinch as he was led away, but Tahu saw it in his eyes, the realization that no amount of charm or family name could save him now. The quiet terror of being exposed not as a man of power, but as a coward wrapped in silk and fraud. Elizabeth sat in the back of the courtroom, her hands folded, expression unreadable. Samuel held one of her fingers the entire time. When the judge called for recess, she didn't cheer or cry. She simply exhaled. deep and full, like someone who had been holding her breath for years. Later that afternoon, Collins handed her the deed. The real one. The one signed by her father and registered legally long before Andrew's schemes began. "It's yours now," he said, unquestionably. "No one can take it again." Elizabeth looked down at the paper in her hand, then back up at Collins. "He tried to make it feel like I didn't belong here." "Well," Collins said, tilting his hat, "seems he was wrong." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Tahu sat atop his paint horse beside the wagon, where Elizabeth and Samuel rode. The land had shifted since they last saw it. It hadn't changed, not really, the same fences, the same mesquite and dry creek beds. But the feeling was different now, like the earth itself knew it had been reclaimed by someone who wouldn't betray it. They arrived just before sunset. The old ranch house still leaned a little to the left. The shutters needed fixing, and the barn roof sagged where the rain barrel had collapsed last spring. But it was home again. Not a piece of paper, not a memory. Real. Samuel ran ahead, swinging the gate wide, then paused on the porch, turning back to Tahu with a grin. "You coming inside?" Tahu nodded once, but didn't move. That night, after supper, Elizabeth lit the oil lamp in the parlor. She sat at the small wooden desk in the corner, sorting through account books and livestock notes that had gathered dust during her absence. Samuel lay asleep on the couch, curled under a patched quilt. Tahu stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the sill. The breeze smelled like autumn crisp, a little smoky, the way it did when summer finally gave up its grip. "I should head out tomorrow," he said without turning around. Elizabeth didn't answer right away. She added a column of numbers, circled a figure, then dipped her pen in the ink again. "You said that yesterday." "I know." Now she looked up. Her voice was soft but not uncertain. "You don't owe us anything, Tahu. You did more than most men would have. You saved my life." Samuel's too. He looked at her then, eyes dark and quiet. "It wasn't about owing," he said. "At least, not anymore." Silence fell between them. Elizabeth set the pen down, folded her hands in her lap. The lamplight flickered across her face, catching the hollows of her cheeks, the curve of her jaw. Strong, tired, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. "He's still talking about you, you know," she said. "Samuel?" She nodded. "This morning he told me he wants to be like you when he grows up. Brave, quiet." Steady Tahu looked back toward the window. "I'm not steady." "Not really, just a man who's been alone too long. That doesn't mean you have to stay that way." She stood and walked toward him, slow, careful not to wake her son. "You don't have to stay because you feel responsible," she said. "You don't have to fix fences or teach Samuel how to track just to pay some kind of debt." He met her eyes, waited. "You don't have to stay," she said again, voice low. "Not out of duty, not out of guilt." She reached out, resting her hand gently on his arm. "But if you want to stay, for any other reason, I wouldn't stop you." Tahu didn't speak. Not yet. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry cottonwoods. A coyote called from the far ridge. Inside, the only sound was the steady rhythm of Samuel's breath and the soft creak of floorboards as Elizabeth walked back toward the desk and sat down beneath the warm circle of lamplight. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. He was still there, and she knew it. The flames in the hearth snapped gently, casting flickers of orange light across the worn walls of the ranch house. Outside, a cold wind swept in from the mesas, rustling dry leaves against the windows and stirring the long grass into whispers. But inside, the warmth held strong. Tahu sat in the old rocking chair by the fire, his broad frame settled into stillness, though his hands worked absently at the leather strap he was mending. Elizabeth stood at the stove, scraping the last of the dishes clean, her movements quiet but methodical. Samuel had gone to bed early, worn out from trying to ride the new colt. Tahu helped him halter that morning. The silence between them had grown familiar, comfortable, but not empty. Elizabeth dried her hands on a rag, then leaned against the edge of the table, eyes drifting toward the man who had somehow become part of her home. "I've been thinking," she said. Tahu looked up. "About?" She hesitated, then crossed the room and sat on the hearth's edge, her skirt brushing the rug. "About us?" Tahu didn't move, but the firelight caught a shift in his eyes. He waited. "I'm not a girl, Tahu. I don't confuse comfort for love. I don't mistake gratitude for something deeper. I know that." She looked into the flames for a moment before speaking again. "This, whatever's between us, it's grown fast, quieter than I expected, but deeper than I thought it could, and that scares me." He nodded once. "Because it matters." "Yes," she whispered, "because it matters." She turned to face him fully now, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I've already lost so much. My father, my place in this town, my brother, even before the truth came out. I can't lose something else." "Not like this." Tahu stood slowly, letting the mended strap fall to the floor. He walked to the hearth and crouched beside her, eyes level with hers. "I didn't stay out of pity," he said, "and not because I felt responsible." Her gaze flicked to his face. "I stayed," he said quietly, "because I chose to." Elizabeth blinked, a tear threatening but not falling. "I'm not easy, Tahu. I'm proud. I'm stubborn. I carry more weight than most women should." "I know," he said. "That's why I love you." The words landed like embers, small, hot, and honest. No grand speeches, no trembling declarations. Just the truth, spoken by a man who rarely used more words than necessary. Her breath caught. "You do?" "I do," he said. "I love your strength. I love the way you protect Samuel, the way you look at a room like it owes you nothing. I love how you hum when you work, how you read aloud like every word matters. And I love how you saw me, not just as Apache, not just as a stranger, but as a man." Elizabeth reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "I never expected to feel safe again," she said. "But you gave that back to me." "I didn't give it," Tahu said. "You built it. I just stood beside you while you did." They sat there for a moment, eyes locked, the fire crackling between them. Then, slowly, she leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. But it deepened, not with heat, but with certainty. It was the kind of kiss that answered unspoken questions, that made promises without needing to speak them. When they pulled apart, Elizabeth's forehead rested gently against his. She closed her eyes. "If we do this, it has to be real. It already is." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached all the way to her eyes. They sat back down near the fire, shoulders touching. No more words, just the warmth between them, built not by chance but by choice. From the hallway, a soft voice called out, "Is the fire still burning?" Elizabeth turned toward the sound. "Yes, baby." "You can come in." Samuel padded into the room, bare feet on the wood floor, rubbing one eye with a closed fist. He stopped in the doorway, looking between them. Then his gaze fixed on where their hands still rested, fingers intertwined. He squinted. "So, does this mean Tahu's gonna be my new paw?" Elizabeth froze, a startled laugh slipping from her lips. Tahu smiled slowly. "Would you want that?" he asked. Samuel shrugged, grinning. "Well, I already like him better than most folks. He lets me ride and doesn't talk too much." Elizabeth pulled her son close and kissed the top of his head. "Well," she said, glancing at Tahu with a gleam in her eye, "maybe we'll all figure it out together." It was a quiet morning, the kind that only came after long storms, emotional ones, too. The sun pushed gently through the cotton clouds as dew clung to the dry grass like it had no reason to let go. Birds circled high overhead, and the ranch, though patched and bruised by months of fighting, stood firm. Tahu was fixing the fence by the eastern paddock when Elizabeth came walking up the ridge behind him, her apron still dusty with flour from the morning's bread. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the split post beside him and watched him knot the wire. "You missed breakfast," she said finally. "I figured the fence wouldn't wait." "It usually doesn't. But I saved you a biscuit." He nodded. "Thank you." They stood together in silence, the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. Tahu shifted, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, then glanced at her. "You know, I've been thinking." "Oh," she said, tilting her head, "I ain't a man of fancy speeches, never learned 'em. But I know what it means to make a vow, and I'd like to make one to you." Elizabeth blinked. "Now? Here's as good a place as any." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a faded piece of red cloth. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing a simple ring carved from antler, smooth and pale, shaped by patient hands. "It's not gold," he said, "but I carved it from the shed of a white-tailed buck I tracked near the edge of the canyon. Took me a week to shape it right. Meant to feel like something real. Like us." She stared at it, hands trembling just slightly. Tahu looked her in the eyes. "Will you marry me, Elizabeth Langford? Not because you need a man to stay, not because the world expects you to, but because I love you, and I want to build a life that holds both our truths." Side by side, she didn't speak for a moment. Then she swallowed hard and nodded, tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, Tahu. I'd marry you even if all we had was the dirt beneath our feet." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit snugly, like it had been waiting. They embraced under the pale sky, surrounded by the scent of sage and earth. And though no one else saw it, the moment was sacred. The wedding came a week later, not in a chapel, but under the cottonwoods by the creek. The same trees that had stood sentinel over this land long before either of them had names. It was a strange gathering at first glance, Apache warriors, elders in layered beads and leather, sitting beside townsfolk in faded suits and Sunday dresses. Sheriff Collins was there, clean-shaven and oddly nervous. Dr. Evans had brought his wife. Even Mrs. Dobbins from the bakery had made an appearance, holding a plate of dried apple slices and pretending not to cry. The preacher spoke in both English and Apache, with White Eagle standing beside him, translating with care. The vows were short, but every word felt full-rooted, like seeds pressed into good soil. When Elizabeth said, "I do," her voice didn't waver. When Tahu replied, his eyes never left hers. Samuel stood between them, proud in his little vest, holding both their hands like he was anchoring the moment. After the kiss, he threw his arms around their waists and yelled, "Finally!" to the crowd, sending ripples of laughter through the gathering. Music rose after that, not from instruments, but from voices. The Apache sang songs of union and earth. The townspeople joined in with old hymns, and somewhere in the middle, the sounds blended into something new. Not perfect, not polished, but true. As dusk fell, the lanterns lit up the clearing in soft gold. People danced, children chased each other around the trees. Tahu stood with Elizabeth beneath the hanging branches, arms around her waist, both of them swaying gently to the rhythm of voices and fireflies. Later, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, Samuel wandered off toward the hill overlooking the ranch. He held his old stuffed bear in one hand, worn and patched from years of comfort. He climbed up and sat in the grass, looking at the stars slowly appearing in the fading blue above. He didn't speak to anyone, but he whispered up to the sky. "I knew it," he said, hugging his bear close. "Family's the one thing nobody can take away." The wind moved gently through the tall grass, whispering across the plains like an old friend with no urgency. Autumn had left behind her golden breath, and winter crept only lightly at the edges. But here, on the land once marred by lies and nearly lost to greed, peace had taken root. Samuel was the first to wake most mornings. He'd pull on his boots, still a size too big, and hurry out to the barn where Blaze, his chestnut gelding, waited with calm eyes and a twitching ear. The boy was learning quick how to saddle without help, how to mount with less wobble, how to guide the reins with quiet confidence instead of fear. Tahu watched from the porch some mornings, cup of hot coffee in his hand, quiet pride etched in the lines of his face. He didn't interrupt. He believed in letting a boy find his own strength. But when Samuel fell, and he did fall, often Tahu would be there by the time the dust settled, offering a steady hand, not judgment. "Try again," he'd say. "Falling's just part of learning how to stay up." In the afternoons, Elizabeth stood under the wide sky with a ledger in one hand and a sun hat shading her eyes. She'd never planned on managing a ranch, but life had a way of asking more of you than you thought you had. And somehow, with Tahu's quiet guidance and the community's cautious support, she grew into the role. She knew how to count the herd by sight now, knew which section of the pasture held the healthiest grass and which troughs needed mending. The ranch hands, Apache and townfolk alike, looked to her with respect that had nothing to do with her last name and everything to do with the way she worked alongside them. Sometimes, in the soft hush before supper, they'd all sit on the back porch together, Samuel with a book in his lap, his voice steady as he read aloud. Tahu had taught him to read using worn Apache stories and frontier journals, letting him trace each word with his finger until they became part of him. Elizabeth would smile and rest her head on Tahu's shoulder, her hand over his on the railing. And for a moment it was easy to forget all the bruises this land had known. But memory has its place. One evening, Sheriff Collins rode up with news from Santa Rosa. Andrew had been transferred to a federal prison, his appeals denied. All the forgeries tied to the land scheme had unraveled with his conviction. And just as quietly as he'd slithered into their lives, he vanished from them. White Eagle stopped by once a week, bringing gifts from the Apache village cornmeal, dried berries, medicine made from desert herbs. He never stayed long, but when he looked at Samuel, he smiled in a way that suggested legacy wasn't always bound by blood. There were challenges still. Droughts threatened the wells some weeks. A wolf took 2 calves in spring. But the difference now was they faced it all together. One Sunday, as clouds rolled heavy over the mountains, Elizabeth and Tahu walked the fence line with Samuel trailing behind them, bow in hand, proud of his first squirrel. The boy talked endlessly about wanting to build a treehouse, about teaching Blaze to bow, about someday becoming sheriff, or maybe a scout like Tahu used to be. Elizabeth laughed. "That's quite a list, Samuel." He shrugged. "There's time." Tahu glanced at her. "There is." Later that night, as fire crackled in the hearth, Elizabeth opened her journal and ran her fingers over the first page. She hadn't written since the trial. Words had felt too heavy, but now her hand moved without effort. She wrote, "The past cannot be changed, but the future is a blank page, and this time we write it together." Outside, snow began to drift down soft, light, not yet ready to stay. But inside the Langford Ranch, where a boy slept soundly upstairs, a man cleaned his rifle with practiced ease, and a woman set her pen down with quiet strength. There was warmth that couldn't be touched by season or shadow. Family had been forged here, not from blood, but from choice, from love, from trust earned the hard way. And somewhere, just beyond the firelight, the prairie stretched out waiting for the next story. Because this may be the end of this tale. But in the untamed lands of the Wild West, stories like this are always waiting to be told. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Western Legacy, where every day a new chapter of courage, love, and redemption is just around the bend.